Hi there, it's Michelle Thomas again, and welcome back to Module 4, Intergenerational Impacts. So here we have our table of contents: effect of family systems upon disruption, physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual impacts, next steps, where do we go from here? So intergenerational impacts is directly correlated and related to residential school as well as colonization. So we get into a little bit of those impacts. So what are some impacts of colonization? And this is really just, again, bear in mind, this is a very simplistic bird's eye view, Reader's Digest version of this, just to give you an idea and understanding of it. So I think one of the main impacts of colonization is loss. Again, if we reflect back on some of the topics that we talked about in previous modules, the whole process of colonization is based on power and control. So an outside influence coming in, having that power and control over every aspect of our life, and historically right from wartime and relocation of our nations, our communities, and our family political systems, and moving them into territories and imposing things such as the Indian Act upon, Indigenous people. So all of that whole process is a lot of loss that we've had to go through, as well as trauma and shock, and that's just the colonization piece. Early historical times, and then we get into the residential school era, and that kind of compounds the loss of our land, and that relocation piece is compounded by trauma and shock as well, because being forced to go into an education system where the main goal is genocide and assimilation, and the associated traumas that come with that: physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, sexual abuse, and all the things that took place in that whole time period, again, adds up to a lot of trauma and a lot of shock to our systems, right? Because in many cases we did not have that kind of lifestyle. In some cases there were, because there were incidences with family breakdowns already happening prior to residential school, like there was alcohol involved, maybe some family violence, and dysfunctional families systems already in place in the family home, and then going to residential school. Some folks have experienced positive, because it was a little bit safer there in that sense. It was very unpredictable in their home, so it provided a routine and a security. So again, that's another aspect to bear in mind, is that everything that we talk about in these modules are very much, one aspect of it. Like, we can't in 4 30-minute sessions really give you a comprehensive overview, and I encourage you to, if you're more interested in the residential school experience, to look up the TRC and to really go through some of those and listen to more survivor stories. There's a lot of videos on there, so you get more of a well-rounded, comprehensive view of things. That not for some people, not everything was negative, and they did take away some value and some benefit, but there was also these more prevalent cases, I guess, of trauma. So having resulted from going through those experiences, a lot of anger, and again, by this point, if we've had many generations going through this, we're looking at that generational level of anger, helplessness, disgust, shame, hopeless. Again, if we're looking at, particularly if you go back to the historical pieces that I mentioned, if we're looking at entire communities that have been relocated into an area, maybe they lived off of the land, they followed the geese, they followed the moose, they followed whatever animals they were dependent on, and then they went to a totally different area that was isolated, where they could not live off of the land. That starts something entirely different, because you basically took away their entire lifestyle. what they were dependent on. That sustainability was not there, right? Because there was nothing for them to do to sustain themselves. So you start in this generational level of hopelessness, right? And financial dependency as well in some cases. So from that, there's a lot of worthlessness, people feeling like they don't have worth, they don't have value, lost, and a disconnection. If you take away somebody's reason for living and their connection to that land, and they don't have the resources, support, financial aspect to really have that assistance that they need to, whether it was from hunting, fishing, however they were making their living, then yes, there's going to be a huge loss and a huge disconnection. So what is intergenerational trauma? What does that's a topic that's the term is thrown around quite a bit these days. But I really just wanted to give you an idea or deeper understanding of what it means. So it basically is a traumatic disruption that impairs the normal functioning of a person. So that's again pretty broad, because what's traumatic to me might not be traumatic to the next person, right? So you have to kind of look at these definitions as very broad and giving you a brief understanding, but it might not. It would apply differently to each person, because we all have our own mechanisms and our own coping skills and how we relate to the world, right? So, and that impacts our functioning as well. So this impairment of the normal functioning, this impairment of our normal functioning, creates then a cycle of learned behavior that affects future generations, right? One of the most common ones we've seen in testimonial videos of survivors is with alcohol, right? Like if we have an individual that has gone through, a lot of times the trauma that they do speak about is sexual abuse. If they've experienced that within that residential school system, that has scarred them on such a psychological and deep level that they're left with that pain and those memories. And it's quite similar to post-traumatic stress disorder. And they experience that over how many years, day-to-day existence. They get out of that school, become a young adult, and they need to learn and adapt and teach themselves how to survive. And often, because of that pain that is carried from that impairment of the trauma, that alcohol becomes a coping skill that helps them to function. So it increases their level of functioning to that of a normal person in their mind, in their experience with their perception, that they no longer have that impairment when the alcohol is there, right? So really, that's a coping skill for them that they need and at that moment in their lives. So if they go through their life, and parenting and having children, doing all of that as a functioning alcoholic or someone that misuses alcohol, and you have a whole generation that feels that impact of those choices. So that one coping skill that for that person was needed because of that impairment from the original trauma then leads to something entirely different for their children. And that's where that intergenerational trauma begins to be felt, okay? And those effects can be felt on every level, mentally, emotionally, physically, and spiritually, as well as sexually as well, because oftentimes sexual abuse is a cycle, and so that whole concept of sexuality really becomes distorted and unhealthy. So a victim quite often becomes a perpetrator. So you may have that happening within the family unit as well. Somebody that experienced it then repeats that cycle. So that's what I just said on the bottom there. If left unhealed, these traumas can repeat from generation to generation, because you have those children then grow up, and then if they experience that sexual abuse, alcoholism growing up, they never knew anything different. right? That was a normal for them. So when they grow up and they parent, they quite potentially could repeat that cycle, right? And I go back to one of the quotes from a gentleman in the a testimonial who says that it's not the survivors that are committing suicide at high rates. It's their children, right? Because that's often where the brunt of those cycles are felt in that next generation, right? Like people are looking to, I guess, release and empower themselves. And unfortunately, one way to get power is to take it away from somebody else. And often, very much, it is not even done on a conscious level, right? Because there's just such an intense level of pain and trauma and hurt and loss that they don't even recognize that this is what they're doing. It just becomes a way of functioning for them. Okay? So intergenerational impacts are a little bit different. The impacts are the behaviors that can result from generations of unhealed trauma, right? So the behaviors that would be when you're getting into a high level of, say, concurrent disorders, where you have folks come in and their clients, and it's not just one thing that they're experiencing or going through, but you would have mental health, you would have addictions, you would have suicide, you would have maybe possibly some other emotional issues, just layers and layers and layers heaped upon them as those impacts because of the behaviors, right, that were passed down. And they learned that and they repeated that. So that's how often we get those folks coming in that have concurrent disorders, because there's just so many behaviors that they were exposed to in when they were parented, right? And originating from trauma, right? And from pain.
Abel. I'm from the Chigang Reserve, and I went to school in St. Joseph's Residential School. I was there for 4 years, and now I've been living in Toronto for over 40 years, and I'm quite happy here.
I'm Christine. My spirit name is Wabshka Migonkwe. I'm hoping I'm saying that right. It's White Feather Woman. I was born and raised in Toronto. My mother attended residential school, and it's impacted my life in a number of ways. In one way that I think it's impacted me is my journey through the education system. As a teenager, I had a number of difficulties and challenges with finishing my high school education. And at the time, I didn't have any real clear idea that of what residential school meant to either myself or to my mother. And so when I did drop out of school, my mom wasn't necessarily adamant in me staying in school. And so as a result of that, I went to work. I think in one ways, because of her experience in residential school, it kind of dictated my my education path as well. So maybe had she had not had such had an experience like that in residential school, she would have been more likely to keep me in school when I was younger. Well, up until that point, I think I was pretty oblivious, for lack of a better word, about anything really culturally. I didn't have a sense of identity within the Aboriginal context. Definitely, I would have probably learned a lot more about myself as a First Nations person if that wasn't taken away from my mom from such an early age. And for a long time, I didn't understand why she wouldn't speak Anishinaabe to us. I didn't realize growing up what that really meant. And that was very difficult for me until I went back to school and I really understood.
I speak a little Ojibwe once in a while, not very often, but it's hard because they've been brought up just speaking English, and I can't converse with them because they don't understand. But it is hard. Oh, maybe it's because too that when we went to the Spanish school, we were I don't know, what do I say? Your Indianness was beaten out of you. You were ashamed to to think you were a Anishinaabe.
First went to university, up until that point I wasn't really aware or really educated on what the residential school system meant to me as an Anishinaabe Kwe or to my family, and especially as someone whose parent went to residential school. And it wasn't until I went to university and I went to a few Aboriginal Studies courses that I really understood some of the impacts of residential school, and particularly how that affected my mother and her life course, as well as some of the things that I went through growing up. So that was really difficult, and it was really hard because, I can talk about it now, but at that time in my life, I hadn't really talked about it at all. I hadn't explored it within myself. I think during that time, I would talk to my mom a lot about that and talk to her about how I was feeling. And, I would, right after class, I would come over and I'd be like, boy, I bawled my eyes out today. And we would talk about that. And there was a dialogue there that we never had before. She shared things with me that were, I know, painful for her and painful for me to hear.
I just wanted to mention something about the common experience. I wrote a letter, right, about my experience and what I went through. All this nonsense, the beating, constant strapping and put downs, and just made my self-confidence I had to write that down for the lawyer, but when I left that office, I felt really good for once in a long time, because every time I used to think about what I went through at the school, I just couldn't talk or think about it. It just made me cry and cry. But now it's all gone. No more. I may not I'm still the same way, but I can think about it now and just, get on with life.
But I didn't know she felt that way about, feeling better afterwards. So, but to me, it's just a reminder of how, it is difficult to reconcile. And it is difficult to get over the past. And we all have these different ways of dealing with the things that have happened, and we're all going through different stages of it. Now that she's kind of at this point, like I think I have to get there now, because it's still new for me. Now it's only now in my life that I'm really connecting with the cultural and spiritual teachings. I've seen an elder, I've received my spirit name, I attend ceremony, and I think that's given me a good center and balance within myself, and giving me a confidence and self-esteem to kind of know my place in the world and what I can do for myself and other people.
Mama, my mother, I love you. Mother, I honor you. Hey, hi. Mama, my mother, I sing for you. Hey, Mama, this song is for you.
So part of their project were the 5 educational videos, and this is a common video that I'll show, just because I really enjoy how you can clearly see how that school impacted those different generations, and the truth that came out of it when the mom and the daughter the daughter was able to hear her mother's truth, and she was never able to really speak about it before. So you get to see a little bit of that reconciliation that happens within the families when they start to break down some of those barriers and deal with some of the pain and the loss and trauma. So, and if you want more information on their project, it's at anishinaabeg.ca. That you can use this as a stepping stone, a place to start, to look at how are those pieces going to fit, so that, and then from there you can use it to help them to set goals, right? Because they themselves might feel a million miles away from their true self, and it might feel like it's not attainable. It's so far out of their reach that they don't even have a clue what that means, right? If they have many, many levels of dysfunctional behaviors that you're trying to heal from, it's going to be unbearable to think of, well, how am I going to get to my true self? So you assist them in breaking that down, maybe even defining that, what they think that would look like, and helping them achieve attainable goals, SMART goals, will help them to see progress. I believe that piece is really important. So recognizing the importance of traditional ecological knowledge, that's something that's really a big term in academic circles, and I would define that as our worldview, the Indigenous culture and worldview of how we see things. I talked a little bit about that holistic way of thinking. Again, what I'm giving you is a Reader's Digest version of that. It can go much, much deeper and certainly much more complex, where you could talk about it for a lot longer than what I'm giving you, but it just gives you a snapshot to know that we do think differently and we do have a different worldview, and it's equally as valuable as that Western linear way of thinking. That we don't fit into that model, and that's okay, because we have our own way of thinking. And when you're dealing with Indigenous clients, it's a good way to understand what that way of thinking is. It's a good practice to get into that way of thinking. That's, if you're choosing to do that as a service provider, you are then making that environment culturally safe for your Indigenous clients, right? So TEK represents values and beliefs, and can be seen through stories, language, ceremonies, songs, any sort of connection that they have to the land, to their territory that they grew up. And again, very different, because Indigenous people have very different experiences. You might have families that have never set foot on their traditional territory, or don't even have any, because of the family system breakdowns. They don't have any connection to that land. They might not even know where their community is or where their nation is. They have a tax card, and that's about it. Sometimes not even that. So we have to recognize that when I talk about this, it's very fluid, because our experiences are all different because of colonization. But this is a part of TEK, right? That connection to the land. And if we've never had that, and you take people back to the land, particularly if you've been raised as urban Indigenous, and you take them to the land and they've never understand that, amazing, miraculous things can happen when you bring that reconnection back, and people can say they didn't even know that they had that part of them was missing, because they never experienced it before. And that's the truth of who they are as people. That's part of their true self. So providing opportunities for this sense of connection can be pivotal to healing intergenerational impacts. Could be something as simple as when you have a meeting with people, allowing an elder into the room, allowing them to have a connection with another person besides themselves that is Indigenous. That's huge. Allowing them to smudge, if smudging is something that they feel is a positive thing for them, then using our medicines, cedar, sweetgrass, sage, and tobacco, using that before they start their meeting, right? Having somebody come in and do a prayer, or opening address or Thanksgiving address, all of those things are part of TEK, and all of those things are a part of making a culturally safe environment. And sometimes just doing that at the beginning of a meeting is enough to potentially diffuse whatever situation needs to be resolved, because okay, this is serious here, and you're inviting in those ancestors that hold that knowledge, right, that connection to the land. You're inviting them into that space where they know that, okay, everything is going to be okay, and it just allows for that truth to come out. So very, very important things here. And if you want to learn more, again, this is just the beginning. You could always learn more. Tom Porter, he's been one of the most inspirational people in my life, and I really wanted to include him, one of my teachers for many years. And he founded this Mohawk community, Ecological. Not sure if I'm saying that right. But it's beautiful. It's near Fonda, New York, and there's a whole story that goes into this history here that I won't get into, but you can certainly look him up online, and he's got a lot of articles that he's put out and some stories about that. Follow him on Facebook as well. They do a lot of educational workshops at his place in Fonda, and they put out a lot of different things as well. So another good resource on Facebook. So yeah, he carries a lot of the TEK that I just spoke of. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of his bio there.
Then I went out to Washington State. This was 2 years ago or 3 years ago. And there's a woman out there, she belongs to the Umatilla tribe. They're related to the Nez Perce, they have the same language. And this one lady's name is Edith McLeod. She's a Umatilla. She has, I think, 13 kids. And she's been my friend for probably 50 years. And she adopted me like an Indian ceremony as her son. And she calls me her Eastern son. And I refer to her as my Western mother. And she calls me every once in a while. She's now 84, 85 years old in a wheelchair. A very beautiful woman from the Umatilla. And 3 years ago, I was over there. And she talked to all her kids and grandkids and the other people at that meeting. And she sat in her wheelchair with her big braids coming way down on both sides. And she always wears that kerchief like those Western tribe does, traditional. And she says, I want you all to listen to me. She says, I want to share something with you. She says, I'm so proud to introduce my son from the East. She says, he's the one who taught me how to really pray. And he doesn't know it because I never told him. This is the first time he's going to hear it today. And she told that story about how the sun hugs us every day because it's the Creator's hands and arms. And she says, and she said that prayer in English, but she uses her Umatilla language. And she said, for more than 40 or 50 years, I've been praying because my young son from the East shared his grandma how she taught him to pray, and it became my prayer. She says, for 50 years. And she says, I've been so grateful. I sit in a wheelchair and I'm still grateful. And so the power it is about tradition and sharing is very great. And we don't know where the roots goes in and never come out. So don't never underestimate yourself when you do good things. It'll find a place to take root for many generations to come. But again, we're only humans. We all make mistakes. And the biggest thing is try not to be unforgiving, especially of your own children and your own nephews and nieces. Even your own family members. And that's the hardest one when you get angry with them. It's hard to forget. And we Indians especially, I know, and probably every race, have the hardest time to forgive. But we have to get over that. Because life is way too short. Pretty soon, it's time for us to go. And here we wasted all this time of being angry or being upset or not talking to our sacred family. Look at how much years we wasted and threw away for nothing. And what did the Creator said? Every day I want to see ear-to-ear smile. I want to see happiness. I want to see joy. And He expects us to be the example and the exhibition of that. And that's not so really hard to do. And that's one of the messages that I spread here or share here. To if there's any sadness in your family or estrangement of your family members, find a way that it can be mended. Sometimes all it takes is to say, I'm sorry. And as long as you mean it, then that's medicine. But don't do like most people do in the world. They say, I'm sorry, and they make the same mistake in another hour. They didn't mean it. But when you really mean it, it's powerful. You say, I'm sorry. And then happiness can come back, begin to come back. Trust can come back. And then there will be a strong families, strong villages all over the place again. I think that's all I want to say about that part.
Again, Tom Porter, just he's somebody that has a really big piece of my heart. I just love that man, and he's awesome because he just lives that life in a good way and is very good at reminding us of our traditions and stories, and it's a living example of that TEK. Richard Wagamese, an Anishinaabe author, I really thought that this quote was appropriate. I heard a wise woman talk at a conference. She spoke of being removed from her culture, unplugged from it, disconnected and set aside like an old toaster. But she was always a toaster, and the day came when someone plugged her back in and the electricity flowed. She became functional again, and the tool of her reawakening was her language. Again, that speaks powerfully to those intergenerational connections that we talk about. Sometimes we, as Indigenous people, we have those losses, and we don't even know what it stems from. But we go through life, and if we're lucky enough, we're able to find those things that help to fill those gaps of things that we didn't even know were missing, whether it's through, like Tom said, reconnecting with our family, finding that peace through forgiveness, through going back to the land, to our ceremonies, through the language. However that connection can be felt again, it is like we reawaken ourselves and we become reconnected and we become closer on that path to our true self. So also Richard Wagamese is the author of Indian Horse. Just finished reading it, and amazing book on residential school experience, and it's a movie as well. Highly recommend that. So next steps are also education is also a big important part of the next steps. So additional resources. I'm not going to go through them all, but they're there for you to view, and I think they're all really important, as well as some books. So thank you again for listening to my modules here online, and again, if you would like to contact me, you can. I'm at the Grand River Community Health Center, and my contact information is on Module 1. If you would like to get a hold of me and like to discuss any of these materials further, or have more questions, or need more resources, I'm always here to help at the Grand River Community Health Center as Indigenous Cultural Safety Coordinator. Now, for listening, and take care. So now, for listening, this is a little bit about me as well. My contact information. I'm at mthomas@grchc.ca. We are over on Colburn Street, and that's my phone number there if you need to contact me for anything. The services available that I provide are cultural safety training such as this, and with that, I really work to tailor to meet the needs of your organization, whether it's training within your staff, volunteers, management, or board. We can work together to develop something that's going to best suit you. I offer support to individuals pertaining to Indigenous issues, such as anyone that has a particular case that they are working on where they are trying to support an Indigenous person and they really need that guidance and that connection to, maybe they need some support people, some more additional resources, some knowledge keepers that can really help to gain support and advocacy for their client. Or if you are an Indigenous person, maybe living in Brantford, new to Brantford, just arriving here from another community, and you really need to have that connection to, our local Indigenous community, being Six Nations or New Credit, I can help to connect you with some individuals to support you as well. Another aspect of what I do is education. We will be hosting 3 conferences in the upcoming calendar year. We have one set for October 25th. That's going to be a Truth and Reconciliation Commission and youth engagement. So we're going to be looking at some of those recommendations and getting youth involved, really just engaging them to think about some of those aspects of the TRC. January 31st, we're going to be doing a conference on colonization. In March, I don't have working with a partner on this one. I'm working with Laurier, so we don't have the date set yet for that one, but it'll be intergenerational impacts and beyond. So again, throughout the year, I'm required to do these pieces that, again, are bridging those gaps and helping to create better relationships between Indigenous folks and others that are wanting to make life a little bit better. Now, if you're listening, and take care.